All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. We're just so happy to have y'all here this morning and to have our panelists. I'm going to introduce Stanley Dry, and then he will introduce the other panelists. Stanley writes the Kitchen Gourmet column for the Louisiana Life magazine, and is author of the Essential Louisiana Cookbook and the Essential Louisiana Seafood Cookbook, and co-author of Gulf South. He's formerly the senior editor of Food and Wine and founding editor of Louisiana Cooking Magazine. His articles have appeared in Food and Wine, Travel and Leisure, the New York Times Book Review, Boston Magazine, and Acadiana Profile. And so we welcome all of you today, and thank y'all so much for doing this wonderful panel for us.
Good morning, thank you for coming. This is Marcelle, Bienvenu. Marcelle Bienvenu on my right. She is the author and co-author of 14 cookbooks, the most famous being Who's Your Mama, Are You Catholic, and Can You Make a Roux, and which also ranks as one of the greatest book titles of all time. She has a long and distinguished history as a journalist, teacher, and restaurateur. Gerald Patout is a retired librarian who has a special interest in Louisiana food and culinary history. His professional career has included positions with the Domino Sugar Corporation and the Historic New Orleans Collection. It was through his efforts that Lafayette Cookbook, originally published in 1922, has been reissued by the University of Louisiana Press. Both Marcelle and Gerald will have cookbook signings for their books in the lobby after our presentation. Marcelle, would you like to start off? Tell us something about how you got involved in all of this.
Now it's on. Well, I didn't mean to get involved in the food industry, but I liked food. And my daddy was a newspaper man, and we had the newspaper in St. Martinville. But he was also a big outdoorsman and a Boy Scout leader. And I was always at his elbow. I had to hold his beer while he cooked on an open fire. And I thought that was, 8 years old. I went, that's pretty cute. You can cook over a wood fire and you don't even have dials. How do you put medium low on? Of course, you just move the pot to where that. But anyway, I was fascinated with that. And I was very fortunate. My mother's family were sugarcane farmers, and my dad's family was the newspaper people. So we had city food and we had country food. And I didn't know there was a big difference. I mean, I never made, to me it was food. The food was food and it was good. I didn't make any, I didn't realize there was different types. But when I went to work for Time Life Books in the early 70s, Paul Prudhomme had just made the scene, the culinary scene. And nobody ever said, Marcelle, we're having Cajun food tonight. Nobody said we're going to have Creole food. I mean, there was no distinction until I think Paul came on the scene. And I was very curious because when I was working for Time Life Books, I realized that everybody didn't eat like we did. There was no gumbo. Well, I went to Washington, D.C. to work in '64, and after 2 weeks I said, Mom, I have to come home. There's no gumbo here in town. She said, well, you could make it. And we did. There were about 8 of us from Louisiana, and we fast became the most popular group because, even Hewitt Humphrey called and he says, I heard y'all we fix a meal every Sunday and invite people. And he told me, he says, I went to LSU Law School. And he says, I've been hearing y'all been cooking every week, so can I send somebody to get a plate? And I said, of course. So, I realized then that Louisiana had such a unique culinary background. And so that kind of led me to really become interested in it without really thinking about it. And not long after I worked with Time Life was when Ella Brennan called me, and she wanted me to go work at Commander's, and I went, no, I'm not doing that. Y'all work on weekends, at night, holidays, and she says, I would never make you do that. She lied. I mean, I was there. I was only off on Mondays. All my friends were the hairdressers. They were awful monkeys. So, being with Ella Brennan when they had just taken over Commanders, and to watch the Brennan family work was just a real great experience for me. And that's how I got in. I'm still interested in food.
Marcelle, all your recipes and the cooking that you do, how much? All your recipes and the cooking that you do, what your family influence on that?
Well, the Who's Your Mama book is mostly recipes from the family. The way the book came to be was I was writing for the Picayune. In '84, I started writing a column. And Mama used to come help me. She said, you get a lot of mail, and they want this recipe and that recipe and that recipe. And we spend half our time copying recipes, and then it's the wrong one. So she said, why don't you just do a book? And I went, oh, okay. So we did. And it was supposed to be called the Bienvenu Family Cookbook. That's real exciting. But there was a play at UL. It was called A Band Inside My Head. And so my husband and I went. And it was a story. It was written by a guy from New Iberia, Marcelle. His last name was Marcelle. Anyway, it's a story about a young man leaving Louisiana to go find his fortune, and he comes back with a girlfriend. And so there's a little ditty song that the aunts and the grandma said, "Who's your mama? Are you Catholic? Can you make a roux?" So I said, that's what I want to name it. And of course, my editor said it's too long. So that's okay, but he used it anyway. So, but most of the recipes, and my mother and father had different. Daddy was a big outdoor cook. Mama was, fancy parties and coffee parties and teas. So it was fun to be around those. And the same for my grandmothers. One lived in town. Her ancestors came during the French Revolution. St. Martinville was known as Le Petit Paris. And learned from the other side of the family, which, a big country cook, boucheries and such. So it has some, and it has a great meaning. I had a student at Nichols a few years ago. He came in, he had the nerve to come into class with a box of jambalaya mix. And I said, what are we doing with that? He said, Chef, it's so easy and so quick. I said, but you know what? You're missing the whole point of cooking in South Louisiana. You're supposed to be in the kitchen with your pals or your family members, and you chop and you stir and you cook and you gossip. So you're missing all that. And there's no heart and soul, and especially this jambalaya mix had Parmesan cheese in it. And I went, oh, poor thing. So I said, don't even think of touching them at Rouse's. Don't even, just look away. Don't use any boxed things.
Marcelle, how has your cooking evolved from the cooking of your parents and your grandparents?
It hasn't changed so much. Well, maybe it has. Because we used to cook, every morning my mother had either cornbread, homemade biscuits, or, big breakfasts. I remember my grandfather, who lived to be 99, and I remember at the funeral home, somebody said, Rena, I'm so sorry, what happened? She said, he got old. He was 99 years old. And I remember him eating like 4 eggs for breakfast, cooked in bacon grease, biscuits. But people were still active then. And he was a farmer, so he was always active. I can't say that really my cooking techniques, well, kind of since I taught. Mm-hmm. I was more aware now of the procedures and but for the most part, I still cook kind of stuff, but Louisiana
what
stuff.
About all the time you spent in New Orleans, and because cooking here and the cooking in New Orleans can be very different in a lot of ways. How much has that influenced your cooking? Well,
first of all, when I went to Commanders, I called my mother up and I said, Mom, they have okra, shrimp, seafood and okra gumbo. There's no chicken and sausage gumbo anywhere in the city. This was in the 70s. She said, don't eat it. It has tomatoes in it. I went, okay. But I said, Mom, when you put up okra in the summer, you put tomatoes in your okra. She said, well, that's different. But, and it was really something to realize that there was such a difference of the two, of the Creole and Acadian thing. And I was amazed when Ella said she wanted to hire Paul Prudhomme, and I went, ooh, I think she's wrong about that, because they always had European trained chefs at Commander's. And I said, I had no vision of poor little uptown ladies going to eat chicken and sausage gumbo at Commander's with the bone, the meat on the bone. I went, this is not going to happen. Of course, Ella had a great thing. She said, just take the meat off the bones before you bring it out. So and Ella and I used to drink Sazeracs in the afternoon. And she would tell me about her family, which were Irishmen. But they could, just like they considered that they cooked Creole, city food, and the same thing here. And there's a lot of Germans in this area and Sicilians, and the French influence was so huge that it just swallowed them up. You know, there was a little German guy in Catahoula where my father would go get his fishing tackle, like the worms and stuff, and he spoke French. And I asked him one time, I said, you don't ever think of yourself as a German? He said, well, my name is German, but he said, I'm Cajun. So, you know, it's amazing what has transpired. And, you know, it keeps changing. Like at Commander's, when Ella Brennan finally, I said, this is not going to work. But she was determined to marry Cajun to Creole cuisine. And they did. I mean, it was amazing. Then when she hired Emerald, I went, oh no, a Yankee, and he's 25 years old, he's never seen a roux, but he was cute. And he turned that, you know, and I think during the 70s and 80s, we had a big evolution of the food all across the United States, I think, you know. And so it was really interesting to be around to see that, and you didn't realize all this was happening.
Okay. Gerald, will you tell us something about how you got involved in food and cooking, and tell us about this cookbook that you managed to get republished?
Okay. Again, I'm Gerald Patout, and I'm going to do my talk from down here, but Marcelle sort of stole part of my story. I actually grew up. Can you hear me without this? Oh, okay. But I got to show them stuff, so. This was really my old stomping ground, the Evangeline Theater, and I was born at the Dauterive Hospital, and my grandmother lived at 630 Main Street, and she was really the reason that I really got into cooking and cookbook collecting, and it's sort of like in my genetic code that, like Marcelle, my mother is a Patout, and my father is a Patout. My mother's side of the family were sugarcane farmers and millers, and my father's side of the Patout family came to New Iberia, and they opened the Hotel Frederick and Gene and Gerald's restaurant. So before I even got out the gate, it was genetic code that I would be interested in food and cooking and all of those types of wonderful things that go along with that in New Iberia in this landscape. And actually, it was my grandmother, Yvonne, who gave me my first cookbook when I was in my 20s. I know I'm speaking to you all with my back, to you. My Rations of Mandy. And she told me when she gave me this cookbook, she said, this is a wonderful old cookbook of Louisiana cooking, and that it has connections to New Iberia and the Shadows and cooking, and I've treasured it ever since. And I think it actually spurred me to go on to become an information specialist, a library, and focus my interest on cooking and collecting cookbooks. So this was the beginning. Fast forward many, many years, and I had a wonderful position at the Historic New Orleans Collection. For 10 years, I was the head of the library, the curator of resources, and they had a collection of some of the most magnificent materials in Louisiana. And in the rare book vault, they had a copy of the Creole Cookery, which was coming apart, literally. The binding was coming off and falling apart. So I applied for a grant from the Culinary Trust. I think it's in Louisville, Kentucky, and they restore and preserve cookbooks. Well, they gave us quite a bit of money to restore this book. This is the first copy. This is a DVD, so my preservation genes kicked in to play at that point. And I really got interested, besides my background in preservation and my studies at Columbia University in book preservation, I realized how to take that old broken cookbook, the Creole Cookery. You can buy this from the gift shop at the Historic New Orleans Collection, that you can preserve cookbooks and our legacy and our history, and that was really important to me. But I felt like I accomplished a lot.
Did you preserve a DVD player to play that on?
I think we have one, but that's a good point, because like 8-track tapes and all of that are fast going out of play. When I was in New Orleans, I also worked with a group of wonderful people, Patout and food writers, and I would go to meetings, and we were developing a bibliography of Louisiana cookbooks, and I learned about a real key to collecting cookbooks. It's called the Rochester Clark Bibliography of Louisiana Cookery. The libraries, most of the public libraries in Louisiana have a copy of this, which was published in the 60s. And this tells you what cookbooks were in Louisiana libraries at that point, done by the Iberville Parish Library. So I found a copy, and this is my own personal copy. I began to look in this and see what was published in St. Martinville and New Iberia and all over. And it really became a roadmap for me to collect. Then I moved back to my home area, and I was the library director at LSU Eunice, and I was still collecting my own personal collection of cookbooks. And one night on eBay, I was surfing the web and searching, and I came across a copy from a dealer in Chicago of Lafayette Cooks. This is the original. This is the only copy. It's got a little chip on the bottom. I bought it. It wasn't a great expense, but I bought it. And when it came in, I started doing my research and I didn't really know at that time, because Lafayette Cooks was not listed in the Rochester Clark Bibliography of Louisiana Cooking. I didn't know this was a real treasure. And I set out to get it preserved and republished, but it wasn't an easy task. I realized that getting the book reprinted would be a job, and I went to various houses, presses, publishers, and they turned me down, but I persevered, and eventually UL Press decided, after they changed directors to Dr. Josh Caffrey, who I have a connection to. He said, Gerald, if you go over to the Methodist Church and you engage them in a conversation and tell them what you've done, the research about the cookbook, we will consider. Well, long story short, they didn't even know that the cookbook existed. I talked to the church historian and other people there, and they eventually found out, yes, we did publish this cookbook in 1922. And it is really a treasure. Here is the new edition. We tried to make it look just like it is. I gave the, whatever you call it, rights, or I didn't want to sell cookbooks at 73 years old. I'm not in the cookbook business, but I did want to preserve it, and I did want to save it. It's got wonderful recipes, old Lafayette families, and the unique thing about this is that it was from the Methodist Church. And again, we all do things differently, like Marcelle said on TV the other night. We all cook etouffees different, because we all come from different backgrounds, different religions, different ethnic groups. And so this was the Methodist, 1920. Now, Lafayette has published some wonderful cookbooks. And so this is really the precursor, a pre-runner to Lafayette recipes that we see in a lot of cookbooks. So it's been a wonderful journey, and I'll finish my little talk by showing you that I had to validate that this actually existed. After I had the original book that I found in Chicago, one day I was digging in the antique shop in Brobridge. There's a booth in there that has a lot of Lafayette stuff, pictures and books and all that kind of good stuff. And I go there occasionally, and I was digging in the bottom of a book, and I found this old 1922 copy of that book, the same one. This is after all the hurricanes, and you see what it looks like in your attic and stuff like that. And when I worked in New Orleans, I used to go in attics all the time to get books, and things were in such bad shape. This is what happens when you leave your cookbook in the attic, or you pass it on from your grandmother, and so forth and so on. So it's been a real journey for me to get this done, but it's been a real pleasure too at the same time. And hopefully, now that I've shown them my rations of Mandy from the 30s, that we can talk about other cookbooks, little cookbooklets that are out there that are probably in your attic or somebody in your family has, that we can get preserved. And UL Press will definitely consider reprinting these because they've had really excellent reception to this cookbook. I have copies up here that I will sell today and sign, but that's basically my...
Gerald, it's interesting to look through this book because in the beginning you have some recipes. There are recipes for chicken and oyster gumbo, crab gumbo, okra gumbo, and there's a coubillon. But going through most of the book, you don't find much that we really associate with Cajun cooking. What's your perspective on that?
Well, based on all of my conversations and dialogue with the church and meeting people at the Methodist Church and people at UL now that have identified certain elements of the cookbook. First of all, the design of the cover we think is Newcomb design. The person was Newcomb. Most of the recipe with the Methodists were Protestants. And this was the Protestant church that it was SLI at that time, came to Lafayette. That was their church downtown. So the recipes reflect that particular. So the coubillon or the gumbos and things are representative of their way of stirring the pot and doing things. So it's very interesting to see that. And there is only one use of the word Creole in here, Creole pralines, never the word Cajun in this cookbook. So I think there's a 1950s cookbook published by Macon Publishing in Lafayette that the word Cajun first appears. So 1922, Creoles, they weren't talking Cajun at that time. For Lafayette being the Cajun cooking center of the United States, so to speak.
Marcelle, isn't it the use of Cajun, the word Cajun, didn't really come into wide usage until what, 60s, 70s? Isn't that about right?
Yeah. When going back to the Time Life Cookbook, I forget her name, Brasher. I think her father was a dean of men at LSU in the 60s. Anyway, she came to the Times-Picayune and she wanted to talk to one of the editors of the Picayune, seeing that they were going to just give us a chapter in the Southern cookbook. Mm-hmm. It wasn't going to be its own book. Mm-hmm. And she spent a few days in New Orleans, and she realized that, well, she had found Paul Prudhomme before we started on that book.
Oh, is that right?
So she had been kind of introduced to the. So when the book came out, it was the first time I had ever seen anybody try to define the difference. And Peter Fieberman, who was the writer, I said, how would he know about New Orleans and all? But he did. And
well, he grew up in New Orleans.
Yeah, he did. And we had a wonderful time. But he had that. He had the knowledge of the New Orleans cooking. And I had told him I knew everything there was to know. I was 23 years old. So I had to make believe sometimes. But I learned a lot during that book, because they had never just said that there was an Cajun cuisine and a...
Well, if I'm not mistaken, didn't they call it Creole and Acadian rather than Cajun?
Yes, there's no Cajun.
Yeah, there was Acadian. So it's very interesting how all this developed. I'll tell you one thing I noticed in this book is very interesting. It's a recipe for pecan pie, okay? The general thought among people who study these things that pecan pie was invented, well, Karo syrup was invented in 1902, came on the market. And in the 30s, supposedly the wife of one of the executives developed a recipe for pecan pie using Karo syrup. And that's really where the historians date the beginning of pecan pie. But I've read that there were recipes for pecan pies, instead of using Karo, using sugar, that started appearing in the 1880s. And there's a recipe in here for the pecan pie, 1922, that uses sugar. This was before the Karo recipe came out. So for myself, I prefer a pecan pie that's made with brown sugar to Karo myself. But I thought that was a very interesting thing. Yes, Joe?
I'd like to make one other point about that and the recipes, and I'm going to do it quickly. What I learned about the cookbook. The Methodist Church, this was done by what was called a service circle. I'm a Catholic, raised in the Catholic family. So this was all a learning experience for me. And coming from an information, historian, academic background, I find if you do a lot of research, you find these things out. And what I found out about the service circles was they gathered recipes in that area, and they were which was very important, because our French culture, our traditions are largely oral, and we tell. Our grandmother tells us, or this one tells. But when you start writing down, gathering and collecting cookbooks and publishing a 1920 cookbook, that was different. And I can prove that because I have other Methodist cookbooks from small towns like Basile, Lake Arthur, and then I found one at the antique shop in Washington, Louisiana, from 1938 from Rayville, the Methodist Service Circles. So the service circle was a mechanism for gathering this information and putting it in cookbooks. And again, books tell us the story, like Peter Feebleman tells us, which is a wonderful way of explaining Cajun and Creole. I use that as a reference tool, and I read it occasionally. He does refer to Acadian. The Methodists were out there gathering these books and compiling it and publishing. So it girds our history of cookbook history here in Louisiana.
Does anyone have any questions you would like to ask Marcelle or Gerald?
Quick question. So if you want to create your own cookbook, how would you go about the process to begin that? I've always wanted to write my cookbook. I'm a cook, and I give food to people, a lot of people. And so they're like, how do you make this? How do you do this? So if in my day and age that I am, but if I've always wanted to produce a cookbook, what would the first channels be?
Marcelle, you have any insight? Well, I think it's a tough road right now, because with the internet and all, the publishers, I think it's unless you see most of the cookbooks that come out are people who developed a name for themselves in a restaurant or TV shows or whatever, something like that. So putting together a cookbook. Now, in Marcelle's case, her first book was made up of articles recipes you had published, right, in the paper. The cookbooks that I did were made up of articles and recipes that I had published in Louisiana Life. And the publisher of Louisiana Life is the one who published the cookbooks. One avenue that is open to you now is self-publishing. And I have a friend who published, not cookbooks, but fiction, 4 or 5 titles on Amazon. Which is something that you can look into. But I think in terms of getting a commercial publisher to take on a cookbook, unless you have something to hang it on, is more difficult now. But it is much easier now to self-publish and to sell those through Amazon.
I would be remiss if I wouldn't say do your research. Go to a cookbook collection and see the various types of cookbook, what they're offering, what you like, how they couch the recipes in there, or their indexes. Can you do these things easily? Are the ingredients easy to find, and things like that? If you're publishing now, because I have tons of cookbooks and I go through them all the time, and some have a great deal of appeal to me. Sometimes you can see, yeah, this really looks good. And I have to say this. I find sometimes that the cookbooks from the Episcopal Church, they're really great. I mean, they have some wonderful recipes in some of these small town Episcopal churches. I'm just using that as an example of when you're going through all these books, you see that and you think, my gosh, that sounds delicious. And then you take, how would I want to present that? What pictures?
I read magazines. I read cookbooks like magazines. So I would rather buy a cookbook than a book. So familiar with all y'all's stuff.
Anybody else have any questions?
So, hi, I'm Bridget. I just wanted to comment. It's not a question that I love the recipes, and I look forward to my Louisiana Life book, a magazine every month. But I just wanted to comment about church cookbooks, because my favorite cookbook is Loreville Catholic Church had this old cookbook with a bunch of fig recipes, because Father Bergeron loved figs, and it is dog-eared and highlighted, and it's my favorite cookbook, and I'll take like 3 different recipes and just kind of combine them into one. So I love church cookbooks, and I too go to the flea markets in Brobridge and all over and try to find church cookbooks, because I find they're just full of, wonderful recipes. But my all-time favorite when I first got married in the 80s was the Daily Iberian would publish the recipes, and I retired about a year ago, and I decided to clean out my cabinet under the oven and discovered some of these old Daily Iberian recipes that when I first got married, that's how I learned how to cook.
Well, these church or community cookbooks really almost tell a history of our world. And I remember one day Ella Brennan says, "Do you know when they started using cream of mushroom soup?" And I went, "No." But it was probably between the 2 world wars. Usually, most probably in the 40s. And, they didn't have cream of celery and cream of everything. So until you see them in the community cookbooks, they didn't have it.
One other good source, I know we have not a lot of time, is companies that produce food like Tabasco and Trapeze, and that have brochures and cook booklets. I collect those too. They have Steen syrup. Some of the recipes on those are wonderful. And what I learned when I was in New Orleans, one of the first and oldest cook booklets that we had were things from a frog company in Rain, like 1908, on how to cook frog legs and stuff like that. So it's amazing, some of these product cookbooks. I have some really old trapeze, okra recipes and stuff like that, and they tell us a lot.
I do.
The best bread pudding recipe is on the Evangeline made.
The bread, is that right?
In Loreville, there's a recipe that Miss Eve Medier, who passed away, like, it was famous, and at her funeral, they had the package from the Evangeline Maid.
Isn't that something?
That started this original. When we get married, we'd call her and say, "How do you make your bread pudding?" and learn from that.
Okay, I think Marcelle is doing a cooking demonstration soon, so I think we're going to stop here. And both Marcelle and Gerald have their books. If you would like to buy a book, and they can sign them for you. Thank you all for coming.